What if the command you carried since childhood, "Don't be selfish," it wasn't a moral truth at all, but a kind of invisible inheritance, like a seed that was planted in soil too shallow to root, never allowed to grow into its full shape? The order was repeated so many times it hardened into law, and now, even as an adult, the thought of choosing yourself first feels like breaking a sacred covenant. Many men live with this quiet law inside them. It doesn't shout, it whispers. When someone asks for help, you agree before your body can even register the cost. When a partner is in need, you give, even as resentment coils in your chest. When your father or mother raised an eyebrow of disappointment, you learned the safest route was to shrink, to erase your own need. That injunction, "Don't be selfish," became less like advice and more like a cursed heirloom, a crown of thorns woven not from branches, but from favors. Each thorn a yes you couldn't refuse, each drop of blood the silent price you paid for belonging. Psychology gives us one language for this. Jung might call it shadow work. The part of you that longs to claim space, to be selfish, was forced underground. Neuroscience adds another lens. The brain rewards predictability. Early in life, you learned that predictability came not from expressing your needs but from suppressing them. Oxytocin, the chemical of bonding, was released not when you received love freely, but when you provided it through service. Your nervous system began to confuse giving with surviving, and yet that shadow, the selfish impulse, does not vanish. What is repressed becomes a phantom creditor. It lurks, waiting for payment. If denied too long, it collects interest through collapse, compulsions, or sudden rage. Some of you know this cycle too well. Weeks of calm service followed by nights of drinking, or a spiral back into pornography, or the sharp tone that slips out towards someone you love. Not because you're cruel, because the part of you that was forbidden to ask has now demanded to be heard. Culture reinforces the ban. The good son, the dutiful man, the one who never complains. Our myths crown him with honor. But notice who is missing from those stories. The man who walks away from obligations that strangle him. The man who refuses the role of caretaker. The man who chooses joy without apology. Dionysus, the god of individuation and ecstatic freedom, rarely gets to stay in polite society. He is exiled, mocked, sometimes crucified in narrative. No wonder so many men mistake self-prioritization for betrayal. This video is not about scolding or romanticizing. It is not about declaring selfishness a virtue or selflessness a disease. It is about structure. The structures of family command, of neurotransmitters, of projection cycles that shape relationships decades later. We will trace how an empath's origin, born from prohibition against selfishness, unfolds across life. We will explore the shadow bargains you never chose but keep paying. And we will lay out rituals, small, measurable, grounded practices that allow you to reclaim the right to prioritize yourself without violence, without collapse, without abandoning love. As you listen, notice what stirs in your body. The quickened pulse when I name the crown of thorns. The subtle shame when I describe compulsions as phantom creditors. The flicker of relief when I suggest that self-prioritization may actually stabilize your relationships. These reactions are not mistakes. They are the map. So let us begin at the root. The forbidden currency, when love itself was confused with service, and the price of belonging became your silence. From the start, many men discover that love isn't given freely. It must be earned through usefulness. As children, they become what I call the servant child, shaped not by their own desires but by the hidden needs of a parent. Sometimes this comes from a mother's wound, sometimes from enmeshed caregiving, where the child is enlisted into the role of helper, confidant, or caretaker, long before he has the strength for it. Outwardly, this looks like maturity. Inwardly, it is a quiet exile. His personal desires are framed as selfish, and selfishness is framed as moral failure. The currency of love becomes service. Neuroscience gives us a window into why this sticks so powerfully. When a child learns that helping, fixing, or soothing earns a smile, oxytocin is released, the same chemical that bonds a mother to her newborn. Over time, the nervous system wires caregiving as the primary survival strategy. Attachment trauma sets in. The child learns not that I am loved, but that I am safe when I am useful. Add to this the Pygmalion effect, where the parents' expectations sculpt the child's self-image, and you have a man who believes at his core, my worth is to take care of others. It sounds noble, but look deeper. Self-sacrifice is rarely a path to intimacy. It is a path to predictability. And when safety feels scarce, predictability beats intimacy every time. You may stay in relationships not because they are nourishing, but because you can anticipate the demands placed on you. The rhythm of service feels safer than the chaos of being fully seen. It is not attachment, but barter. So what happens decades later? The hidden wound begins to bleed through subtle ways. Exhaustion after a day of endless yes, resentment disguised as politeness, or an undercurrent of bitterness that leaks into relationships. The empath becomes a man who gives relentlessly but feels invisible because he was trained to confuse usefulness with love. There is a way to test this. Imagine logging the favors you perform in a day, not to punish yourself but to notice the motive behind each one. Was it avoidance of conflict? Was it guilt? Was it the hope that someone would finally approve of you? The body often reveals the truth before the mind does. A racing heart, a shallow breath, the small sweat of saying yes when you meant no. These are not flaws. They are the nervous system's receipts. I once read a man's story online, in a community of those raised by narcissistic parents. Every time he told his mother, "I'll handle it," she recorded it in her own invisible ledger. Years later, when he attempted to claim independence, she weaponized that ledger. "After everything I did for you, after everything you owe me," what he thought were acts of kindness were being tabulated as debts. The film Ordinary People captures the same silent bargains, where love is given not as presents, but as a transaction. The trigger here is exclusivity, the unveiling of what has been hidden. For many, hearing this is like opening a secret vault. I thought I was loved for who I am. Perhaps I was loved for what I could do. It is a painful realization, but pain is also a teacher. When named, the wound begins to loosen its grip. And so the question that lingers is not, how do I stop caring? But rather, what would love look like if it were no longer a transaction? For many men, the law of the father is not written in stone tablets, but carved silently into the nervous system. It begins with the smallest gestures, a disappointed glance, a withheld word of praise, the sudden coldness after a refusal. Authority becomes intertwined with morality. To disobey feels not just risky, but shameful. The young boy learns quickly. Shrink your desires, erase your needs, and perhaps you will stay in his good graces. In Jungian language, this is the father complex. The child does not see his father as a flawed human being, but as a living compass. The father's moods and demands become internalized as truth itself. Nietzsche might describe this as a distorted will to power, where the boy mistakes strength for the ability to self-erase in service of another's authority. Neuroscience shows us what this does to the body. Chronic cortisol patterns form under the constant threat of rejection, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and decision-making, becomes less capable of sustaining a firm no. Saying no does not just feel difficult. It feels dangerous at a physiological level. The hidden wound here is profound. To retain paternal approval, the son sacrifices his own emerging identity. He performs as though he is small, and over time, he begins to believe it. The shadow dynamic is shame-based self-erasure. A man may achieve much in the outer world, but internally, he carries the imprint. I am only safe if I do not oppose authority. Here lies the paradox. Reclaiming power is often mistaken for narcissism, as if to assert boundaries is to become domineering. But true strength is reparative, not destructive. A disciplined, bounded self does not suffocate relationships. It stabilizes them. Think of Machiavelli, often caricatured as ruthless. What he actually argued was that boundaries, when held firmly, create predictability and order. Boundaries in this sense are not weapons. They are signals of reliability. One man told the story of leaving a family business where his father's control was suffocating. For years, he played the obedient son, sacrificing his ambitions to maintain peace. When he finally tested one boundary, declining a request politely but firmly, he expected collapse. Instead, he discovered two things. The relationship did not end, and he tasted for the first time the stability of self-respect. Nietzsche would call this not abandonment, but self-overcoming. The move from being ruled by another's command to standing within one's own axis. The governing trigger here is fear of loss, mixed with the desire for control. The empath fears losing the bond with the father figure, so he controls himself into smallness. But that control is a cage, and cages, no matter how familiar, corrode the spirit. The invitation is not to rebel recklessly, but to notice the voice inside you that still echoes paternal law. The phrase that tightens your chest when you consider refusing. The inner sentence that says, "If I don't obey, I will lose everything." Those are not universal truths. They are inherited scripts, and a script, once seen, can be rewritten. So the question that rises is simple, yet disarming. Whose law governs you still, and what part of you has been made small in its shadow? There is a particular exhaustion that comes from always being the rescuer. On the surface, it looks like devotion, stepping into chaos, fixing what is broken, offering stability where there is none. But beneath that devotion lives a quieter truth. Often, the person you are trying hardest to save is the person who mirrors the very parts of yourself you cannot face. Jung would call this projection. We exile the emotions we find too threatening: rage, need, hunger, and then we find partners or friends who embody them for us. Instead of tending to our own hidden fire, we attempt to put out theirs. Neuroscience shows us the hook. Every rescue effort gives the brain a small spike of dopamine. Like a gambler pulling the lever of a slot machine, you are rewarded intermittently. Sometimes your efforts soothe them, sometimes they don't. That unpredictability makes the cycle addictive. Over time, the brain rewires itself to favor the loop of rescuing, mistaking it for connection. The hidden wound underneath is the fear that if your needs were visible, you would be unlovable. So instead of asking, you offer. Instead of expressing, you invest in someone else's turmoil. Their chaos becomes a smokescreen for your own. The shadow dynamic is clear. The rescuer archetype avoids his own rage and longing by pouring himself into another's fire. The counterintuitive truth is this: you are not drawn to broken partners because you can heal them. You are drawn to them because they preserve your identity as the rescuer. To remove them would be to face the question you have long avoided. What do I need when I am not saving anyone? Think of the couple in Revolutionary Road. He is drawn to her wildness, she to his stability. But what they are really doing is sustaining each other's misery. He rescues her from despair, she rescues him from emptiness. Neither dares to sit with their own shadow. This is why so many relationships built on rescuing feel magnetic and unbearable at the same time. The bond is real, but the foundation is projection. I've read threads where men realize this years into a marriage. One wrote, "I thought I was saving her from her addiction, but I was avoiding my own loneliness. When she got sober, I didn't know who I was anymore." That confession cuts to the root. Sometimes the rescue is not about the other at all. It is about the part of yourself you are terrified to meet. The trigger that unlocks this recognition is curiosity mixed with shock. When you pause in the act of rescuing and ask, "What am I avoiding right now?" the answer can be unsettling. Am I avoiding my grief, my anger, my fear of emptiness? That pause is not a cure, but it interrupts the automatic loop. It shifts the rescue from reflex to choice. The deeper question is not how to stop helping, but whether you can risk being seen without the costume of the rescuer. If you stopped saving others, what would you have to face within yourself? Generosity, when it flows from an open center, can nourish both giver and receiver. But when generosity is used as currency to secure belonging, it becomes a mirror for exploitation. Many empaths discover this not in theory, but in the quiet ache of relationships where their endless giving seems to fuel only someone else's appetite. The hidden wound here is conditional love. As children, many men learned that affection was awarded only when they performed. The smile came after the chore was finished. The hug was warmer after compliance. Slowly, generosity was no longer an expression of the heart, but a strategy to maintain connection. By the time adulthood arrives, giving feels less like a choice and more like oxygen. Without it, they fear abandonment. Neuroscience helps explain why this dynamic is so sticky. The brain's reward system, especially the ventral striatum, lights up when approval is given. The empath becomes addicted to these small doses of validation. When paired with a narcissistic partner, the cycle intensifies. The narcissist consumes the generosity, rewards it just enough to keep it flowing, and withholds affection when it stops. For the empath, this intermittent reinforcement binds them tighter. It is not love, it is training. The counterintuitive truth is unsettling. Unregulated generosity can actually create predators. A man who believes his worth lies in what he gives may unconsciously train those around him to take more, not less. His moral high ground becomes the very tool that others use to maintain dominance. Generosity, in this light, is not inherently good or bad. It is powerful, and like all power, it requires boundaries to remain clean. History is full of these dynamics. Consider the system of patronage in Renaissance art. On the surface, it seemed noble. Wealthy patrons supporting artists. But generosity was never free. It bound the artist to the will of the patron, shaping what could be created, what could be said. The gift was also a leash. In The Talented Mr. Ripley, this same inversion plays out. The appearance of generosity conceals manipulation, dependency, and control. The trigger here is fear of rejection. If I stop giving, will I still be wanted? If I draw a line, will love vanish? These questions are not abstract. They live in the body. The tight chest when delaying a reply. The restless hands when resisting the urge to offer more. These are not signs of weakness. They are the nervous system's way of rehearsing loss before it even happens. The shadow truth is this: generosity that ignores the self is not kindness. It is a disguised plea. Please do not abandon me. To transform generosity into strength requires a shift from impulse to strategy. Not withdrawal, not coldness, but discernment. To give when it aligns with integrity, and to withhold when it erases you. And so the deeper reflection becomes, when you give, are you feeding another's growth, or are you feeding their control? When selfishness is forbidden, rebellion does not disappear. It goes underground. Many empaths become experts at playing the martyr, outwardly compliant, inwardly simmering. The wound at the center is the moralization of desire. From an early age, selfishness was equated with sin, so every impulse to choose oneself was buried. But what is buried does not die. It mutates. Neuroscience offers a lens here. Suppressed anger increases activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detector. Over time, this heightened vigilance destabilizes the self. The more the anger is denied, the more the nervous system struggles to regulate. This leads not to saintly calm, but to periodic loss of control. Binges with alcohol, pornography, food, or sudden outbursts. The will that tries to silence anger only intensifies it. Schopenhauer once wrote that desire is ceaseless, and repression makes it even sharper. The counterintuitive truth is that many empathic men are not as selfless as they appear. They are rebellious, but in silence. The refusal to voice needs becomes passive aggression. The smile hides resentment. The late-night indulgence becomes a substitute protest. Their body revolts in private against the life their words cannot refuse in public. Consider the myth of Prometheus. He defied the gods by stealing fire, not openly but through cunning. His rebellion brought light to humanity, but it also chained him to endless punishment. The empath's rebellion often mirrors this myth. Their unspoken anger lights a secret fire but also binds them to cycles of guilt and relapse. I recall the story of a man whose decades-long battle with binge drinking ended not through sheer willpower, but by naming his anger daily. 2 minutes, pen to paper, rating the heat inside him. It was simple, but it changed everything. His binges had always been the rebellion of a silenced self. When the self was finally allowed to speak, if only on the page, the rebellion no longer needed to come through the bottle. The emotional trigger here is urgency, not in the sense of panic, but in the recognition that suppressed anger seeks release now, not later. The small rituals that channel anger, cold water, breath, movement, offer immediate relief, not as solutions, but as honest outlets. Without them, rebellion leaks out sideways. The deeper truth is sobering. Selflessness, when enforced, becomes its own form of violence. It is not the clean generosity of choice, but the quiet coup of a self at war with itself. To recognize this is not to condemn empathy, but to admit its cost. And so the question lingers, is your selflessness a gift freely given, or is it the mask that hides your rebellion? For many men, weakness is not just feared, it is despised. From childhood, they were told to endure, to hide need, to keep silent about their hunger for comfort or help. Masculinity was presented as a mask of stoic strength, a performance of invulnerability. The wound here is not only personal, but cultural. It is the archetype of the ashamed noble, the man who tries to embody strength but secretly trembles, equating vulnerability with failure. Jung would call this a distortion of the persona, the mask one wears to navigate society. When the mask hardens, it no longer protects, it suffocates. Neuroscience confirms what this costs the body. Suppressing need elevates cortisol, straining the nervous system. But the reverse is also true. Practicing honest requests, even small ones, lowers stress hormones and strengthens the brain's capacity to regulate. Each honest expression of need rewires circuits of shame into circuits of resilience. Nietzsche offers a lens for this paradox. His concept of amor fati, to love one's fate, invites men not to despise their limits, but to embrace them as part of strength itself. Weakness, reframed through this lens, is not a defect, but a doorway. To admit need is not to collapse. It is to affirm life more fully. Asking becomes a discipline. It is not indulgence, but training. The counterintuitive truth is that honesty about weakness expands capacity. A man who can say, "I need support," without shame, is not diminished. He is grounded. The brittle mask of toughness is fragile, but the man who integrates vulnerability with strength becomes unshakable. His axis does not depend on performance. It grows from coherence. Athletes sometimes show this more clearly than philosophers. When a champion admits injury or fear publicly, it does not reduce their stature. Often, it deepens it. The honesty strengthens trust, showing that leadership does not require the erasure of need, but the integration of it. The trigger here is rebellion. To ask for help, to admit weakness, is to break an ancient prohibition. Culture whispers, "Do not show need, or you will lose respect." To defy that whisper is itself an act of strength. Each request, each small admission, is a refusal to let the mask dictate the whole of your being. So the question emerges, what would happen if you treated weakness not as a flaw to be hidden, but as a teacher to be apprenticed to? The deepest wound of the empath is not only the prohibition against selfishness, but the terror that choosing oneself will annihilate love. From childhood, belonging was conditional. To be accepted meant to silence personal needs. To assert oneself risked exile. The archetype here is the threshold walker, standing at the edge of a door that feels both sacred and dangerous. Step through and love might vanish. Stay behind and the self withers. Neuroscience gives us hope here. The brain is plastic, always reshaping. Small acts of self-prioritization, when repeated consistently, rewire reward pathways. Dopamine can be linked not just to external approval, but to inner regulation, to the quiet satisfaction of honoring one's axis. The Pygmalion effect also applies inward. When you set expectations for yourself and declare them to others, you shift how both you and your relationships respond. Over time, the script changes. The counterintuitive truth is that self-prioritization, when ritualized and bounded, increases relational stability. It may feel like betrayal in the moment, but over time it strengthens bonds. Why? Because love built on truth is sturdier than love built on silence. The paradox is clear. The selfish act, in calibrated doses, is the most generous contribution you can make. History and myth have always pointed to this. Odysseus, after years of wandering, regains his identity not by serving others, but by reclaiming his name. Only then can he return home in wholeness. In modern times, small communities of men have practiced no-give days, rituals of deliberate receiving, to break the spell of endless service. These acts did not destroy their relationships, they renewed them. The emotional trigger here is promise, not of grandeur, but of immediate benefit. Rituals that yield small wins of regulation remind the nervous system that selfishness does not equal abandonment. Imagine beginning each day with a 10-minute axis ritual, movement, breath, a single statement of boundary. At first, discomfort rises. Over time, the body learns, I can exist as myself, and still belong. Weekly practices of deliberate receiving, or monthly commitments spoken aloud, extend this training. The deeper shift is not only behavioral, but existential. To claim the right to be selfish is to reclaim identity. It is not an abandonment of love, but a reparation of it. A man who honors his own axis gives more cleanly, without resentment, without hidden rebellion. His generosity is no longer a plea for safety, but a choice rooted in strength. So the question becomes, what small ritual could remind you, not in theory but in the body, that your life is yours to inhabit fully? We began with the image of a seed that could not grow, a crown of thorns woven from favors, and the ancient law forbidding selfishness. Along the way, we traced how this command shapes lives, through the servant child who trades desire for duty, the father's law that governs through shame, the rescuer who avoids his own chaos by saving another, the generous giver who becomes a mirror for narcissism, the martyr whose rebellion seeps out in silence, the stoic who hides his weakness until it corrodes him, and finally, the threshold walker who dares to ritualize self-prioritization. 3 working lenses have guided us. The Jungian shadow, showing how denied parts of ourselves return disguised as patterns. Neuroscience, with its maps of dopamine, oxytocin, and plasticity, revealing how the body encodes service as survival and how new rituals can rewire it. And the Pygmalion effect, reminding us that expectation, whether from a parent, a partner, or ourselves, sculpts identity as surely as stone takes the shape of the chisel. The practical thread through all of this is simple, though not easy. Small, measurable acts, the 30, 60, 90-day rituals, serve as experiments rather than commands. Daily boundary statements, weekly practices of receiving, monthly covenants spoken aloud, none heroic, none grand, but each one proof that selfishness, in calibrated doses, is not abandonment. It is boundary, repair, and identity work. The moral clarity is this: to be selfish in these ways is not to wound others. It is to prune the vine so the trunk can grow strong. In a garden, if every branch expands without restraint, the whole plant weakens. But when some branches are cut back, the trunk roots deeper, the shade expands, and the garden thrives. So the final image is of a garden where not every vine sprawls unchecked. Some are trimmed, some are directed, and the trunk is allowed to stand tall. Selfishness in this sense is not a vice, but a way of cultivation. Without it, the garden collapses under its own weight. With it, there is balance, resilience, and room for life to flourish. And perhaps the quiet question to leave with is this: in the garden of your life, which branch must be pruned so the trunk can finally stand?